if an army on the front line starts to doubt that it's going to get more ammunition, more food, more water, that it's going to lose all of the support that it needs to keep going, it will very quickly lose the will to keep pushing forwards because it'll be worried that it becomes ever more isolated, unsustainable, and will end up meeting a grisly end. So getting after the logistics train is a very, very, very potent way of halting an army. And I think the Ukrainians should double down on doing exactly that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are speaking to James Heappey, who was Armed Forces Minister for 4 years in the UK until March 2024. He was a British infantry officer for 10 years and served in Northern Ireland, Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's also at Times Radio to host Superpowers, a series on geopolitics and the future of defence and security. It's 1 o'clock or just after 1 o'clock UK time on Thursday, the 26th of September. James Heappey, good to see you again.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for having me on.
So, James, President Zelensky is in the US at the UN General Assembly at the moment. A lot of the focus has been on the crisis in the Middle East with all the fears of all-out war. How much attention is Ukraine getting, and what are your initial thoughts on what's been said and the meetings so far on this Thursday lunchtime?
So, I think out with the really big headline stuff that's come out of both Moscow and the US today, the simple answer to your question is that Ukraine is not getting enough airtime. What's going on in the Middle East seems more urgent, more pressing, and is sucking up all of the diplomatic effort. And so in that sense, timely for Zelensky to get on the plane, go to the UN General Assembly, work the corridors of the UN very, very, very energetically, and then to go to Washington with a really big ask of Biden and his administration. But my sense is that Zelensky, he's a pro at this. He's been doing it now for 2 years. He knows the key moments to reinvigorate international support, and it seems to me that his trip to New York and Washington is far from wasted, even if maybe he hasn't got exactly what he wanted.
And he's presenting his plan for victory to President Biden and also Kamala Harris. But the meeting with Donald Trump looks like it's off. Seems to be over a fence that Donald Trump took over Zelensky's visit to an arms factory with senior Democrats in the swing state of Pennsylvania. Does this overshadow that victory plan?
Yes. The victory plan, first of all, discussed the degree to which there really is a victory plan in which there are months to run in this war towards an all-out Ukrainian victory. That seems militarily rather ambitious to me. But it is really important, I think, to remind people in the US that this is a war that Ukraine can still win, and therefore their support is not pointless. Their support will bring about the outcome that is best for both Ukrainian and Western security. Now, to your question about Trump, deeply, deeply regrettable that something as relatively minor as a political spin on a visit to an arms factory should deny Zelensky the opportunity to sit down with Trump. It's a worrying omen for what might happen if Trump were elected. In most of the biggest Western donor countries, Zelensky visiting just a few short weeks before the general election would be an enormous moment for the leader of the opposition or the rival presidential candidate to get FaceTime with Zelensky and project themselves as a global statesman. So the fact that Trump doesn't prize those images does, I worry, reveal to us where Ukraine is in President Trump's mindset, and the pettiness of the snub, particularly worrying. Worth also saying that Zelensky's team, having said to you just 2 or 3 minutes ago that he's a pro, they should have spotted the political poo trap in going on a visit with Democratic politicians when it's election season. There would have been a way of playing that would have been less politically exposing for Zelensky.
Yeah, because the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he's accused Zelensky of election interference. And he's calling for the resignation of the Ukrainian ambassador to Washington. Do you think that this was just really a genuine political faux pas?
Like I said, I think that I think on both sides, it's a mistake. It's a mistake on Trump's part not to want the meeting with Zelensky. It's a great opportunity to project himself and actually to draw attention to how Trump would solve the Ukraine issue, which would have been a very important thing for him to say to the US electorate. But you're absolutely right. On the Ukrainian side, this should have been spotted. In my experience, when I've been an outbound British visitor visiting places around the world, our embassies and high commissions are scrupulous in making sure that that we don't fall into any sort of political moment that damages the relationship. And similarly, when there are inbound visits, there have been times when, in election season where the visiting presidential candidate has sat down with me in the MOD. So I found that a week or two later, the High Commissioner or the Ambassador has arranged for their opponent to come and sit down. Diplomats do this for a living. The Ukrainian embassy in Washington have probably dropped the ball a bit.
So this Thursday lunchtime, we're still waiting for the details of the victory plan to come out, but among them are Zelensky's demands for future security guarantees. How can that be done, in your view, while Ukraine remains out of NATO?
Well, it's difficult. It's interesting in what it implies to Zelensky and his inner circles thinking. Security guarantees almost certainly accompany some sort of territorial compromise. Now, I think that's a big evolution if that is indeed the case, and that's where Zelensky and his inner circle have got to. What those security guarantees look like, really interesting. Who gives them, even more interesting. NATO membership, when the summit in Washington was on just a few months ago, was definitely off the table because the sort of Article 5 part of the NATO treaty just meant it really hard for Ukraine to join and then be guaranteed by that NATO thing. So is this a sort of more ad hoc thing with the P3 or the Quad or sort of wider G7 thing? Discuss. All the detail will need to be seen. But Kate, your question says it all. How on earth do you do a security guarantee unless the conflict is fully resolved? You risk effectively just becoming a party to an active conflict.
Now, the announcements on the permissions for the use of Storm Shadow missiles to strike deep into Russia were expected around now. And no surprise on the timing of Vladimir Putin telling his Security Council he's proposing changes to his nuclear doctrine to consider an attack by a non-nuclear state, i.e. Ukraine, as a joint attack if backed by a nuclear state, i.e. the US or the UK. If you were in the British government now, how much consideration would you be urging for these remarks?
If I was in the British government right now, I would be one of the voices around the table saying, let's just do this. Let's just give permission for Storm Shadow to be used on Russian territory. And frankly, like we've done on 2 or 3 occasions previously, force the American hand by the decision that we take unilaterally. I understand why that's an enormous thing for a government to do. I understand why the UK government now might be a bit nervous about it, especially after they broke rank over arms exports to Israel a couple of weeks ago, which caused real pain for Biden and his team in Washington. So to do it again might be regarded as a big thing. And the Americans do react very negatively to it when we've done it in the past. I mean, many people would tell you that the reason Ben Wallace didn't get the US support for the NATO SecGen job is because of main battle tank, Leopard, Abrams, Challenger 3. And the Americans were really annoyed that their hand was forced because we went there first. I think sometimes needs must. The UK's role in this conflict so often has been to punch through the threshold first and drag others behind us. And I would do exactly the same on this.
Of course, President Putin's efforts is to scare the West and Ukraine's allies into being cautious about escalation. And you mentioned Ben Wallace. He said when he was Britain's defence secretary, he got round these concerns about escalation by making secret deliveries of British-supplied NLAW anti-tank missiles at the start. Is it possible that the same thing could or has happened on the actual use of Storm Shadows deep inside Russia?
I think that the story would have broken if Storm Shadow had been used already inside Russia. I think it incredibly unlikely that you would have not found out. I think the Russians would have been really quick to have shown you, as in the media rather than you personally, Kate, the sort of the reason, the evidence that these weapons have been used. So my sense is that they haven't yet, but I think you're right. I think the first we will know about it when the decision has been taken is not some big announcement that gives Putin the opportunity to then sort of use rhetoric to respond. It'll be the fact that the weapons have been used, and then Putin will be defied to respond. You and I think, on a couple of times when on Frontline, have spoken about the way that the UK achieved the West achieved escalation dominance in the first 6 months of the war. I think that this is one of those moments where Putin is trying to get escalation dominance by rewriting the nuclear doctrine to deter the donor community from allowing cruise missiles and other long-range precision strike systems to be used on Russian soil. I think this is exactly the sort of moment where you just have to really embolden yourself to say, we're going to achieve the escalation dominance. We know what Putin's playbook will be. If a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, I could have told you that he would do something around nuclear doctrine, a nuclear threat, in order to try to set some panic around the donor community. I think we've just got to accept that that's what he's going to do and hold course.
When you hear that, you said that you were expecting it. Do you kind of dismiss it as ridiculous?
No, I think if I was still sat around the table in a National Security Council meeting or a Cobra, you have to, consider very seriously the degree to which he means what he's saying. And you'll have an eye on the posture of Russia's strategic forces in order to understand, whether or not there's any action on the ground that backs up the rhetoric. But a lot of the people around Putin are no strangers to the nuclear dance. They were very senior in the latter days of the Soviet Union, and they're well used to being a nuclear power. And I think they understand what it is that really messages to your adversaries that the nuclear threat is being raised versus the rhetoric. What the rhetoric does is really worries non-nuclear allies who are less familiar with the kind of nuclear dance and the way that force postures escalate. But that's a big effect in itself, breaking the cohesion of the donor community and starting to get some of the countries that, understand the nuclear threat less to be less committed to the cause and even to challenge what the UK, US and others might do is a really good strategic outcome for Putin, and hence why he's doing it.
Let's take a look inside Ukraine itself. Both Russia and Ukraine will have an eye on the oncoming winter. What will Russia and Ukraine be doing to prepare?
Look, it's hard fighting to fight in a Ukrainian winter. So from the most basic level, i.e. trying to source winter boots, winter uniforms, and all of the things that make life in trenches half bearable in the depths of a Ukrainian winter, but then all the way through to just this reality that there's a period on the shoulders of the winter, in the autumn and in the spring, when armoured manoeuvre becomes almost impossible because of the sort of quagmire. Interestingly, in the depths of winter, the ground can become so frozen that you can manoeuvre again. But they will be thinking through how do they hold the positions that they've got into when the fighting season sort of stops. What can they do over the winter in terms of engineering to fortify those positions when they're thinking about matters defensive? And they'll also be thinking about how do they use the winter as an opportunity and maybe a less intense tempo of fighting on the front line. How do they use that moment to bring forces off the front line, refurbish them, and then get ready potentially for some offensive action as soon as weather allows in the spring. So in many ways, although the winter might seem like a really inhospitable and grim time, make no mistake, it is. It's also a really useful operational pause when both sides get to sort of do a bit of refurbishment, re-engineer some of their defensive lines, prepare their plans for an offensive and their logistics for an offensive in the spring.
And there is disagreement amongst analysts as to how important the city of Vuhledar is in the Donbass region. If it does or has fallen to Russia, how do you see it? And can you see what gains or developments on the battlefield you'd be looking out for there to be significant gains?
So I got myself in a tears 1,000 times about various towns and villages that I'd never heard of when I was a minister, because they feel important because of the velocity of the fighting that has happened in the locale. The reality is that very few relatively small towns or villages are actually of any strategic importance. They can take on quite an emotional importance, and sometimes for the morale of the fighting force, they can become totemic in a way that makes them all of a sudden matter. There was there's been a number of places actually where both Russia and Ukraine have just poured endless resources into the defense or the offense of a place that has no real tactical consequence. Where the fighting is now obviously matters. There is a line on the western side of the Donbass that I think most of the analysts I've ever spoken to say is a land that's pretty, patch of ground that's pretty favourable on which for the Ukrainians to defend because of the topography and the supply lines and whatever else. So if the Ukrainians would push back from that, then you'd have to start having a look at the map and work out where the next obvious bit of geography was to create the next stop line. And that might mean ceding quite a significant amount of territory, because there's no point trying to defend on unfavourable ground and just being attrited constantly. You want to preserve combat force and re-engage on a line and a time of your choosing. So it's a very, very long-winded way of saying I don't know, to be honest with you, whether Volodar is a strategically important place or not. My instinct is that nowhere is ever as strategically important as it's thought to be, and that invariably, if it were lost, you would very quickly start to think that the next place that they were scrapping over was the most important place.
And Ukraine has really shown what it can do on deep strikes using drones in Russia, with these recent attacks it's carried out on a large armament depot in Toropet and then a huge depot in Tihoresk. I'm not quite sure if I've said that right, but apologies if I haven't, to our audience. Is Ukraine reaching the point where it can seriously slow Russia's ability to wage war by methodically targeting Russian logistics at source?
100%. And by the way, I think that's been the case from the very beginning. It's just been giving them the means to do so. I mean, they are steely warriors, and they're crafty in the way that they design their missions, and they're pretty audacious too. So the ability to strike into the Russian depth, disrupt their logistics, disrupt their command and control, is definitely the way that a David fights a Goliath. That is definitely the sort of, in the Western NATO parlance, we call it the maneuverist approach. You don't pitch strength against strength. You seek to push strength against what you perceive to be your adversary's weakness. And invariably, the sort of depth is weaker than their depth positions, where their logistics and their command and control are invariably easier targets, softer targets than the sort of armored formations that are close in. So I think we should be doubling down on our support for Ukraine with that sort of capability. Just take the legs from under the Russian offensive, and then grind them to a standstill, and then attrip them with glide bombs.
And the advantage to all of this is that it actually stuff doesn't even get to the battlefield in the first place.
Exactly that, and that has two effects. There are sort of three parts of combat power: the conceptual, how do you fight; the physical, what do you fight with; and the mental, do you have the will to fight? And actually, when you're attacking logistics chains, you're attacking two of those three components of fighting power. Physical, obviously, you're removing ammunition, you're removing supplies, you're removing replacement vehicles and fighting platforms. But on the moral component side, if an army on the front line starts to doubt that it's going to get more ammunition, more food, more water, that it's going to lose all of the support that it needs to keep going, it will very quickly lose the will to keep pushing forwards, because it'll be worried that it becomes ever more isolated, unsustainable, and will end up meeting a grisly end. So getting after the logistics train is a very, very, very potent way of halting an army. And I think the Ukrainians should double down on doing exactly that.
And you mentioned just briefly there glide bombs. What are you suggesting Ukraine should have or should be able to do?
Well, look, I think the announcement that the US are going to furnish Ukraine with glide bombs is a very big deal. It is the Russian use of glide bombs has proven to be devastating. Real mass of munitions that you can just drop on front lines that can't be interdicted by electronic warfare or anything else. Just gravity doing what it does. and it's been incredibly effective. So giving the Ukrainians the American equivalent of the system that the Russians have been using sends a really big message to Russia that they'll reap what they sow. But also, says to the Ukrainians that here's another commitment that the US is making to the Ukrainian cause. It's not the absolute top of Zelensky's list. That was the ability to use ATACMS onto Russian soil. But nonetheless, as a consolation prize, walking away with a new supply of glide bombs, is it Joint Strike Weapon they call it? That's a really big win for Ukraine, and will have a big psychological effect on the Russian front lines when these glide bombs, and I think I read earlier today in some of the immediate reporting of the announcement that they're likely to be glide bombs carrying cluster munitions. Well, cluster munitions are the absolute devil for enemy in trenches on the front line, because they just, they obliterate a really wide area as they are deployed. And the psychological impact of that, when you're hunkered down in your trench, already hiding from some pretty miserable weather, and then all of a sudden you start just having all these bomblets raining down on you. Awful, awful, awful experience, and may well break the Russian will. Who knows?
Do we know how many and when?
No, I've not seen anything on that. I've just a headline announcement that they are part of the new package.
It's really, really interesting development, isn't it? And
It is.
Something that's been the bane of the Ukrainian forces' life. So interesting to see the tables turn and the effect that's actually going to have in the coming months,
100%.
if it is in the coming months. Just wanted, if I may, to draw your attention or get your thoughts on some comments made by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, in his international meeting for peace in Paris. He called on a new international order and a rethink on relations with Russia in the future, and the Organisation of Europe, acknowledging that the current world order created after World War II was incomplete. A new model needed to take into account equal representation for all European nationals and larger peace-building tactics. Why do you think he's saying this, and do you think he has a point?
Well, look,
You're looking for the diplomatic answer, aren't you?
yeah, look, it's not language that I would seek to use at this point, because I think it can sound awfully conciliatory to Russia. And I've never subscribed. There was a time at the very beginning of the war where the media handling advice for me as a UK minister, a sort of regular spokesman for the UK government, was to really, and relentlessly say Putin, never Russia, in my sort of condemnation of what was going on. And the big idea was we needed to vilify Putin, alienate him from the wider Russian elite, but not alienate Russia from the European community that we hope one day to reconcile it to. I think Putin, I think Macron is, communicating today in a very similar vein, and it's definitely the case that whether Russia, hopefully Russia will be completely vanquished in Ukraine, and when a vanquished Russia, licking its wounds, probably going through some very traumatic political moments as well, looks westwards, I think it probably does matter to sort of validate Macron's point that Russia feels like there is a route back to being a part of the European Union. There's no doubt that the Russian elite in Moscow, and particularly St. Petersburg, see themselves as Europeans, not Asians with China as their obvious partner. But I think that Macron is choosing, when Zelensky is in New York talking about victory and trying to embolden both sides of the US political system to stick with them for another year, another 2 years, another 3 years, maybe having that sort of talk about a sort of reconciliation with Russia feels a bit premature and counterproductive at this particular moment.
What do you think that Western countries should be doing now to prepare for a post-Putin Russia, to avoid the kind of mistakes of the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed?
Well, I dispute whether or not the way that the West engaged with Russia in the 90s and early 2000s was particularly wrong-headed. I think that the return of someone like Putin, it just played to a sense of Russian nationalism and Russian identity as a superpower. And in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was going through some pretty significant internal domestic things. And I think the West has to be really careful, because if the West is too visibly seeking to take over and be part of a transition in Russia after the war in Ukraine, appears to be meddling in Russian politics, I think the reaction of the Russian people will be incredibly negative. So if I were the West, I would focus on defeating the Russian army in Ukraine, restoring as much territory as possible, if not even all of that territory, then worry about what you do in Russia thereafter. I think if you try and run with hound and hare, zero compromise on the battlefield in Ukraine, whilst hinting at compromise around the wider long-term strategic relationship, I just think you kind of, it just...
Confused.
Yeah, exactly.
And as for ending the war in Ukraine, there are some hard choices ahead, aren't there? There was once the Zelensky mantra of victory at any cost. Is he now facing the prospect of peace on the best terms possible? And if so, what would that look like?
Look, so I no longer have any privileged information. So this is simply my reflection on the mood music of his trip to the UN General Assembly and then onwards to Washington. It feels to me as if they are starting to see an off-ramp that might not be full territorial restitution. But my view is that the position of the UK government and the wider donor community should be that that is our aim until it is explicit from the Ukrainian government that that is no longer what they're seeking to achieve. That I think the moment that you even half indulge, that Putin gets to bank any of his territorial game, the game is up. I mean, you might as well effectively just draw stumps immediately. So until Zelensky wants to stand up and say that, I think we all have to keep giving them everything they need to achieve an absolute victory.
James Heappey, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Kate, thank you very much indeed.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.